I'm Kimberly Franklin, the education librarian and a member of the open access team. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next presentation. The next presentation, entitled Evergreen, Passing and Implementing a Green Open Access Policy at Cal State East Bay, will be presented by our colleagues, Daisy Muralles. Her pronouns are she, her, and Daisy is the Equity and Open Access / Open Resources Librarian at Cal State East Bay. And Lana Mariko Wood, her pronouns are she, they. And Lana is the Scholarly Communications Librarian at Cal State East Bay. So please join me in welcoming Daisy and Lana.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that introduction. I'll just jump right into it then. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here this morning. My name is Daisy Muralles, and I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm here with my colleague, Lana Mariko Wood, she, they, and we are both faculty members at the University Libraries of Cal State East Bay, as mentioned. And today, as mentioned, we're talking about this Evergreen, passing and implementing a green open access policy. I can provide a little bit more information about our backgrounds and why we're here. I'm the Modern Languages and Literatures liaison. I also teach information literacy courses, provide reference and research services to our students at Cal State East Bay, much like my colleague, Lana Wood, who's the Scholarly Communications Librarian and has been key in establishing some foundational projects and programs around open access and student basic needs at our campus. Lana is also the liaison librarian for the nursing department and the public health department, which was formerly health sciences. But full disclosure, I had nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today, at least not the policy or the development of that policy at Cal State East Bay. I'm here because of my role as the Open Resources Librarian and this year's coordinator for the Affordable Learning Solutions Program, Lana at Cal State East Bay. Lana and I have been working together to implement open programs and initiatives that are offered at Cal State East Bay as a suite of programs and resources that can be used by faculty, by departments as potential tools to meet their equity gap goals, and in general, just raise awareness and do outreach about open data tools, the OER that can support the classrooms and courses, and also, of course, of what we're going to talk about today, the open access policy, and also advertising our open access policy publishing fund. And so we've been doing kind of a bit of a roadshow on these topics on our campus. And thank you for today being able to provide some background around our open access policy. And so I know that a land acknowledgement was already provided. I just wanted to point this out for those who are living and working in Ohlone territory. We wanted to highlight a particular organization called Sogorate, which is an urban Indigenous woman-led land trust that facilitates the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous people through voluntary shumi payments by non-Indigenous people. And so we can drop in the chat, I believe my colleague will drop it, in the chat, more information about that. And so we know this definition of open access, free, immediate online availability of research articles coupled with the rights to use these articles fully in the digital environment. But open access can be attained via two primary paths: publishing in an open access journal, which is gold, or retaining author's copyright and posting a copy of the article to an institutional or subject repository, which would be our green open access. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So what is a green open access policy? It is a rights retention policy, one that provides collective coverage on scholarly articles, and it flips the default to retaining copyright unless the protected author opts out from this policy on an article by article basis. A version of the article or the work is then deposited in a repository, much like ScholarWorks, and that makes it open access. And so a little history on this type type of policy. It is definitely based on the rights retention open access policy that was first adopted at Harvard and then Stanford, MIT, and the University of Kansas. And this type of policy now can be found in over 80 universities. In some cases, these are policies that cover entire schools within universities or departments within schools, so which is a really interesting thing to also remember. And these policies are often typically initiated by faculty for faculty, right? We want to be able to support our research and scholarship. And a lot of this presentation that we're going to be providing is going to be a case study focused on the open access policy efforts at Cal State East Bay. However, like I'm alluding, we aren't the first to do this work and have benefited greatly from colleagues across the CSUs who have worked on it previously and across, of course. So for those interested in learning more about the CSU-wide efforts specifically, you can review the compiled history of OA in the CSU document, which is available on the Confluence website. And that is also being shared in the chat. And so what does a CSU-wide look like? I think we need to address this before we even continue on with what we're going to talk about today. It is important to address this because we can't have a CSU faculty policy at this like the UCs have. Unlike the UCs, the Academic Senate of the California State University cannot pass policy, which is, getting into words. It can pass resolutions. And so with one which Mark Bibley actually helped shepherd through, one that is called Resolution in Support of Faculty Publication Rights with a Green Open Access Policy for the California State University. However, my understanding of the intention was to force legal counsel to draft a policy they approved of. That process began, but was cut short as more pressing COVID issues took hold for the CO committee members. The link being shared in the chat is the Resolution in Support of Faculty Publication Rights with a Green Open Access Policy for the California State University. So if you want to explore that, that is also being added in there. And now I just wanted to provide that little bit of an intro, but Lana, who has been a champion in this work, will continue to describe what this case today that we were talking about, what it looks like at Cal State East Bay. So Lana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daisy. Good morning, everyone. And now we're going to shift the presentation to focusing more about looking at what happened at Cal State East Bay as a case study. And discuss how this policy could be adopted at other CSU campuses. We would love to see all 23 sister campuses adopt this policy, since we're not able to pass it for the entire CSU system as they did in the UCs in 2009. Okay, next slide. So early working on this, I started here at Cal State East Bay in January of 2016. And I remember pretty early on going to a conference at University of San Diego. It was the Digital Initiative Symposium. And there was someone there from Kansas State who had worked, from the early days on their open access policy. And she said that it's going to take a long time. And I was sitting there in the audience feeling very optimistic. And I was like, it's not going to take that long in East Bay, open access has been around for so long, like we're going to be able to move this forward. But unfortunately, she was right. So these are my children, and our first public open access event, which was really more like part of our strategy, was just building awareness about open access, finding who are other people who are invested in open access are across the campus. So our first public open access event was in late October of 2017. And this is my older child here. And the open access policy wasn't signed until May of 2021. So I created a whole new human that didn't exist in that 5-year period. And then here's the older one here, who's, the proud big sister. Okay, let's do next slide. So in those 5 years, a lot happened to make this policy, come to life, be signed, and be implemented. So we started with a awareness building campaign about open access, and that really became the strategy after conversations with Carmen Mitchell from Cal State San Marcos. and how their attempts at passing an open access policy at San Marcos really got shut down in the Senate process. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, there was just more conversation about open access, open science, open scholarship before we started moving towards this. So this open access awareness campaign really started in 2017, and we continue to do it and continue to scaffold it throughout this entire process and into the future. So we also do Open Access Week events, and you know, Daisy and I have been doing a lot of outreach and promotion around our open initiatives for the last 6 months or so. So in 2018, I met with Emily Chan and April Gilbert from San Jose State, and to talk about, because they had also tried to pass open access policy in their Senate, and it ended up getting watered down to a statement of support, which doesn't have the legal implications of the green open access policy that we're talking about today. So Emily and April's advice was to look for like-minded faculty to work with, so that it isn't just a library initiative, that it's clearly something that faculty from across the colleges want. And they also, you know, April Gilbert was really like so helpful in talking about like, well, how do you scope out who these people are, right? Because, you know, we can always have these open access awareness building events, but people may not come. And one of the things that she suggested to me is to look at who is already inclined to share their work openly, you know, whether or not they're allowed to do it legally. Because it's more like you're looking for people who have the spirit, who want to be sharing this work. So, you know, April suggested like tracking faculty members on ResearchGate, academia.edu, like these commercial repositories to see like who's active, who's posting their work there. So I did that, and I kept a running list of people who I wanted to recruit for this effort, you know, trying to be mindful of having people from each college. And around in the same year, 2018, I had the good fortune of meeting my primary collaborator on this policy work, Vanessa Yinling, who's a professor from kinesiology. And I met her at a meeting that we had that was bringing together a lot of different stakeholders about establishing money to pay for Gold Open Access publishing funds. You know, we're very happy that now Daisy and I, you know, with working with our collaborators at Cal State L.A. have adopted a funding model similar to that at Cal State L.A. So we finally do have that. But I remember back in 2018, it was sounds great, but no one has the money to put into this. So Vanessa and I started working together to think about, well, that can be a longer term goal to find the money to pay for Gold Open Access publishing. But in the meantime, there's this, you know, quote unquote free solution for increasing our open access, which is to have a green open access policy. So Vanessa and I really started hustling, doing presentations in the Committee on Research, and trying to just, you know, check the temperature for such a policy and see what we could do. Vanessa and I were really surprised that when we went to the Committee on Research, which, you know, is a standing Senate subcommittee, that there was a lot of misunderstanding about open access, a lot of misconceptions, and a lot of hostility towards just the concept of open access. I think the misconceptions are probably pretty similar to what anyone who works in this space are used to, you know, the coupling of predatory publishing with open access, people who, you know, see any work as like requiring that faculty publish in open access journals. So we realized that we had a lot to unpack to be able to move this policy forward. So based on the approach that was taken at Cal State Fullerton, we decided to use a similar type of orientation to this work, which is to present this policy as a faculty author rights policy first. So really focusing on the individual benefits to the faculty members by being able to have this rights retention, and then also talking about open access as a public good, particularly as we are all state-funded institutions, as Dean Rodriguez mentioned in his remarks. So we found that to be a much more easier to sell policy when we focused on those faculty author rights. We continue to meet with stakeholders. So I think in 2018, I met with the Senate chair, who became a key advocate for this policy, because, you know, I hadn't been at Cal State East Bay for that long at this point, so I didn't really understand how Senate functions. So I think having someone who is an amazing parliamentarian, who has a seat at the table with the president, with the provost, and with other stakeholders, become a champion of this policy, really helped to get this policy through the Senate process. So we also created the Faculty Author Rights Task Force through the Committee on Research, which would be the official body that drafts policies, supporting documents, and pushes it through up the Senate chain to hopefully be passed. Okay, so that brings us to about the halfway point in 2019. And unfortunately, that was a frustrating year because we got stuck in a chicken and an egg type scenario with legal counsel, where we couldn't move the policy forward in the Committee on Research because there were people who had concerns that we need to have the blessing of legal counsel before we could even consider this in the Senate. However, on the flip side, legal counsel wouldn't comment on our policy because it hadn't moved through the channel. So it was more of just like a theoretical thing that they may or may not have to deal with. So we were just kind of stuck in a holding pattern of waiting for legal counsel while legal counsel didn't have the bandwidth to respond because it wasn't an official policy yet. So we decided to strategize with the Senate chair to think about how to move it forward. And what we decided is that, you know, legal counsel may not respond to us as faculty members, but they will respond to the president. So if we can push this policy forward under the condition that that such a policy can't take effect until the president signs it, then we can get legal counsel to respond. So in 2020, the policy was passed unanimously in the Committee on Research and went on to the Senate. And that's when we had already been doing a lot of proactive outreach to senators to try to talk about any concerns that they might have, try to get them to be stakeholders when this policy made it to the floor. But it really wasn't until the days leading up to the first reading that we started to get responses to this type of proactive conversation. And we did get a lot of intense comments and conversations from senators. Many of them we were able to address through, one-on-one type conversations to talk through what their concerns were about this policy. Anytime that we had a conversation with someone about this policy, it went into our FAQs, which we treated as a living document throughout this process. But we still had one holdout from the senators who really was vehemently opposed to this policy. So once it did make it to the Senate floor for second reading, it was passed with one nay vote, and still moved forward. So it went to the president. The president got input from legal counsel and came back to us, deciding not to sign it, and with a long list of changes that needed to be made that were drafted by legal counsel. So that brought us into the next academic year, into academic year 2021, where we reseated the task force, responded to all of the concerns from legal counsel, and sent it back through the Senate channels. It passed unanimously in the Committee on Research, and it did pass unanimously in Senate, which we were really excited about. The person who had previously voted nay was not a senator, but I actually met with him and his colleagues from the history department, and we were able to resolve their concerns and have that department's support in the long run for this policy. This type of policy at any of our campuses in the CSU requires the signature of the president to be effective. So the president ended up signing it a month after it passed in the Senate, and it is effective now. So let's go to the next slide. I'll talk more about some things that happen in the process. So not surprisingly, the open access community, the broader, international and national community around open access is incredibly open and supportive in these efforts. And Katie Fortney from the UC system, from the California Digital Library, and Peter Suber from Harvard were just invaluable advisors throughout this process, including their willingness to help me address Katie. Katie is an intellectual property lawyer. So having her insight when I got asked more tricky copyright type concerns was invaluable. She helped with, addressing drafts to make sure that we didn't lose the legal protection with the changes that were being asked for. And Peter Suber, is basically the godfather of this type of open access work in these types of policies, and having his support and his eyes looking on our work was really invaluable to moving it forward. Okay, next slide. So these policies are a lot of work, and I think part of it is, even though this is a buy-in for faculty type policy, so you really do need to get the buy-in from senators. It requires a lot of buy-in at multiple levels. So these are sort of who I've grouped as the key stakeholders throughout this process. So for us, we decided on our campus that it would be best to work through the Committee on Research as the Senate body that moves it forward. But that is about, I think it's like 12 members in CR, and those members, we needed to get buy-in from all of them to be able to show that we were moving forward unanimously as a committee for this policy. As I mentioned, our faculty author rights task force was made up of a member from each of the colleges, so all 5 colleges, and we also had a lecturer on the committee as well. So we did a lot of dividing up the senators, so that if anybody had a personal relationship with a senator, that that person become their contact from the task force. And then if people didn't know them personally, then we divided it up by college, so that you were speaking to someone who is at least from the same college, if not also has similar disciplinary practices with publishing. As I mentioned, our Senate chair was instrumental in the behind the scenes conversations with the president and with Senate strategy. We had a lot of conversations either through the Senate chair, through the deans, or directly from myself with upper administration about the value and the importance of this policy, because we wanted to ensure that that we had buy-in from the president and the provost, so that the policy wouldn't die, but would be signed and take effect. Our library dean has been a longstanding supporter of this policy and this work, and it was important that he show that type of leadership and that willingness, because passing the policy is just one step, and then you actually have to implement it. And so with these policies, the implementation falls to the libraries. And so you need to know that the dean is on board and willing to help with implementation for this. And then because this is a faculty rights policy, and just generally, we wanted to make sure that we had the support of our union, the faculty union, CFA, California Faculty Association. So I started looping in CFA very early on in the process, because we wanted their support, and we wanted to make sure that there was no conflict with the central bargaining agreement, the CBA, which is very fortunate that we did that, because that was one of, I would say, a stalling tactic by legal counsel, was to say, well, this policy shouldn't be a policy, it's a bargaining issue. And then we were able to come back and say, actually, CFA said there's no conflict with the CBA, so it is not a bargaining issue, and we can move forward through this Senate process. Okay, next slide, please, Daisy. So our roadblocks, there were many. It was challenging working with legal counsel. I think that other CSU campuses are in a much better place now to be able to move past this hurdle much more quickly, because part of what we were hearing from legal counsel is that they wanted to make sure that East Bay's policy, that it was done right, because they knew that this policy would become the template policy, the model policy for other CSUs to adopt. But I think legal counsel, you know, their concern is making sure that we're minimizing, eliminating, not taking on any more risk, like risk for lawsuits and so on. So it did require a lot of conversations and a lot of awareness building with legal counsel about the fact that these policies have extremely low risk, that we're not reinventing the wheel here. Harvard has had their policy since 2008. The UCs have had their policy, you know, shortly after that. And 80 other US research institutions have had these policies with 0 lawsuits. So really emphasizing the low legal risk and the high societal and benefit of these policies was important. I would say the breakthrough that was probably most helpful was, you know, Katie Fortney from the UCs is, she is an intellectual property lawyer and specializes in open access. But really it was her looping in her colleague, Angus McDonald, who is a practicing lawyer for them and part of the UC's legal counsel, who is a strong supporter of open access, to have those conversations with our legal counsel, lawyer to lawyer, you know, legal counsel to legal counsel, that is, to be able to talk about, you know, their own process with understanding this, that the benefits outweigh the risk, that the risk is minimal for us to move forward with legal counsel. At East Bay too, we had kind of unfortunate timing with a reckoning that was happening in our Senate, which is that we had a professor emeriti, Professor Christensen, who for many years in the economics department had been teaching racist theories about eugenics. And there was a lot of public scrutiny about, you know, how this professor was able to continue to teach and cause harm to our students, and a lot of press around this professor. And that led to conversations about the fact that we didn't have an academic freedom policy, that, you know, we didn't have a good way to, I guess, any policies for what happens in a situation like this. And our open access policy kind of got confounded in this discussion because we didn't have an academic freedom policy. So there was some conversations that we had to have about why we can have this open access policy without yet having our academic freedom policy. So that ended up delaying this by a few months as well. Okay, let's go to lessons learned next, Daisy. So I would say that from our experience here at Cal State East Bay, you know, we worked with all these different stakeholders. We worked with faculty members from the other 4 colleges at our campus. The library is a college as well as a lecturer from one of those 4 colleges as well. But as the library faculty member, I think that, you know, who's working on this primarily, that you need to be prepared to lead the effort, like do a lot of the behind the scenes work, do a lot of the organizing, do a lot of, you know, the drafting of materials, but not always be the public spokesperson. Because, you know, I think that though library faculty are faculty, we're not always seen on the same level as faculty from other departments. So having vocal supporters from all the colleges was really important, and especially those, you know, who are publishing in specific ways, to be able to talk to other faculty members about the benefits of this policy. I think I already covered the second one. I'd say that throughout these 5 years, we were really finding and growing our champions, so that we had support at all levels of the university. I also should mention too that we did a number of events that included students. So also sharing, you know, open scholarships benefits with students, talking about, you know, paywalls and that sort of stuff. so that we knew that we had support from students as well as we were doing this work. Develop robust supporting documents, be prepared for all kinds of questions, very specific questions, very broad questions, lots and lots and lots of questions. And, you know, continue to reach out to the open access community for support. We have some links in that as well. And then let's go next slide, important considerations. Okay, so one thing that I learned early on in working on the system-wide level committee is that in the CSUs, we have a hodgepodge of intellectual property policies. We have campuses like East Bay that have an IP policy that explicitly states that faculty retain the copyright to their scholarly articles. We have campuses that have a policy that explicitly state that faculty do not retain the copyright to their scholarly articles, and that work is considered work for hire. But the majority of the campuses have no policy at all. So that complicates, you know, being able to know how to draft the policy to encapsulate that. There's a way to draft the open access policy, so it works for all three scenarios, but you need to know where you're starting from. As I mentioned, legal counsel told us that the East Bay policy is going to be the model policy for the system. So start with the East Bay policy and modify, you know, as needed. We did have to wordsmith some to satisfy different stakeholders in the process, but there is a clause in there that you can't remove, otherwise you don't retain the copyright, and it sort of loses any collective power that this policy has. And I would also say it's very important to include your local CFA chapter early in the process and ensure that CFA is bought into this as well. Okay, and now I'm going to hand it back over to Daisy, who's going to talk about implementation.
Yeah, thank you, Lana. So, like, I'm assuming that in our minds, we're thinking, so if we build it, will they come, right? So we have the policy, and we have an opportunity then to build a lot of momentum around, you know, around open access, but around open culture on our campus. And hopefully this is also, and this is of course CSU wide as well, but there will always be critiques. And one of those arguments is that rights retention is a hurdle. Without this type of policy, people have to fight though for their rights individually, and depositing your work will be the harder piece to complete. And so it's like, hopefully we're piecing it up into different battles that we have to tackle. But, and we know this though, as we know this from the universities that have done this in the past, like Harvard, who have experience in this type of policy for several years. For example, from the good practices for university open access policies, most green OA policies face two problems: get the files and get permissions. Right, retention, green OA policies face just one: get the files. And so hopefully with this policy, you know, it's one less hurdle that we have to jump through. And that brings us to the implementation, which is a very key component to the policy, right? That we have this tool, this mechanism to support this work, and all of a sudden that implementation piece needs to happen. And a lot of this is just raising awareness, building that momentum around open access and understanding the policy. And this has come through a lot with Lana and I. We've been doing a lot of different types of presentations, kind of like a roadshow we mentioned, specifically catering to different audiences. So we've talked about the open access policy to our liaison librarians so that they feel more confident and comfortable talking about this policy to the departments that they support. We've done this this type of presentation also just to our campus wide, to faculty, so that they know what their rights are and they feel more comfortable and have an opportunity to ask questions. And then we're also talking to administrators and soon deans actually to have that support also coming around so that everyone's well versed and feel comfortable and confident, and there's less stops along the way for someone who's doing this individually. And then hopefully soon we'll be able to have these conversations also more public, and preparing some communication around that. And one of the things that is upcoming though, we are also exploring an automated deposit process, but we require, like many things, additional staffing to implement these pieces. And so some of the resources that we do have available and we want to share are, of course, the good practices for university open access policies, the Coalition of Open Access Policies Institution document, and of course, the East Bay's Open Access Policy Senate documents. And those we can share along the way. But I think now that pretty much wraps it up. We're open to discussion, and we're of course here to help with all these different pieces. I might have flown by that. So all the links to all those different documents are in the chat. But just to reiterate that last piece, it really is about having multiple types of conversations and understanding who you're talking to, because the librarians are going to have a different approach with that information. And then the faculty who are in different departments also have different environments that they want to be able to understand that information as well.
Yeah. I see Tiffany has her hand up.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience with this policy on your campus. Something we've been thinking about at LA is kind of the author's rights for students in particular, around like theses specifically right now, but was there discussions around how this policy would apply to student researchers? And was there discussions about including them in that, or was there a reason they weren't? I don't know if this is making sense. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So we also have had those conversations, you know, as depositing theses and dissertations can be a requirement for some of the departments on campus, I think the majority of them. But these types of policies, these green OA policies, are by and for faculty members. So that's sort of usually the extent of which the coverage occurs. So particularly because they need to go through, best practices to go through academic senate. Academic senate tends to only cover faculty. So in terms of who's covered by this policy, we defined it as anyone who's Unit 3 faculty in the CBA, which includes, you know, both tenured and tenure track faculty, also lecturers, you know, coaches, counselors, you know, obviously librarians too in the tenure line, and anyone who's covered by the emeriti policy, so faculty emeriti. At the UCs, what they did, so they passed their faculty policy through the Senate, first at UCSF, and then for the UC system as a whole. And then they're flipped from us. So their president of the UCs oversees the whole system. That's our equivalent as the chancellor of the CSUs. So the president of the UCs passed a policy that applies to all UC employees. So it extended the benefits of the open access policy to UC employees, which includes graduate student researchers if they're GSIs, as well as student employees. So it's more about like jurisdiction. I don't think that the Senate has the jurisdiction to protect students, but you know, the president of our school, I think part of the next phase is, you know, talking with our president at East Bay to create a policy that extends to cover additional people at East Bay. Any other questions? Okay, I see a couple hands. Kimberly, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned earlier in your talk some of the roadblocks or pushback that you received. Can you talk about any that might be related to the RTP process itself? Was that something that came up? Were faculty members concerned about their RTP experiences in relation to this green OA policy?
Yes, Kimberly, you are spot on. RTP is definitely, so that stands for retention, tenure, and promotion. And in you know, in many ways, it's the guiding document for faculty in the CSUs, right? Because we want to be able to keep our jobs, we want to get tenure, and we want to get promotion, and you know, that's important for us to be able to stay here. So that did come up repeatedly, and what you know, our policy does, and just best practice for these type of policies, is that there's a no questions asked opt-out option for it. So these policies, when we talk about flipping the default, we're talking about the relationship between the researcher and the journal, right? We're not so much talking about the relationship between the faculty member and the university. So the typical relationship is that as an author with a typical publishing agreement, you have to transfer all of your copyright to the journal as a precondition for publication. These policies flip it so that you automatically retain your copyright to your articles rather than transferring it to the journal, unless you choose to opt out of the policy on an article by article basis. So that opt out is crucial for talking about, you know, RTP concerns, because let's say that you are in a department, the College of Business on our campus has a journal list, right? And if you want to get tenure, you should expect to have some publications in the journals that are on this journal list. But what happens if those journals require or like prevent you from making your work open access? So in that case, what you would do is you would opt out of the policy for that article, and you'd still be able to publish, you know, exactly where you want to, or you're expected to be able to, you know, achieve tenure and promotion. So we copied the UC's opt-out forms. So if you go to like that open access policy page, you'll see that there's like three forms that you can request: an opt-out, an embargo, which is where you delay access for a set time period, or an addendum for your publishing contract if you wanted to inform your publisher, which you don't have to do, but you could choose to do. And a faculty member just enters in their information and they're automatically granted that waiver. So there's no question that they'll get that waiver if they request it. It's automatic. And I'd say that was the piece that we kept coming back to reassure faculty on a number of reasons, but especially around RTP. Thanks for that question, Kimberly. Jayati, I saw your hand was up earlier. Do you still have a question, or was it similar?
Yeah, it was similar to what you mentioned about roadblocks. If you'd feel comfortable sharing the other roadblocks you faced, particularly I saw you had one no on University Senate in the voting. So would you be able to share that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So I don't know what it is about history departments, but we're not the first campus to have had a lot of resistance from history faculty. It happened at San Marcos. It happened, I believe, at Fullerton, and as well as, you know, schools beyond the CSUs. Usually what it comes down to is that history is primarily a book field, right? So they're primarily publishing monographs, books, and at CSUN too, so at Northridge. And those monographs, you know, generate some income for the faculty member who's publishing it because of royalties and whatnot. However, the policy, this open access policy, doesn't apply to books and monographs, right? It applies to scholarly articles, but there is often like a miscommunication about that. So oftentimes with history professors, once you explain like this doesn't cover books, this only covers articles, that might be the end of their concerns. The additional concerns that we encountered at East Bay with our faculty, with our history faculty, were about their concerns for the like more boutique in the history field, and they're concerned that this type of policy might put these smaller, usually society publications out of business. So we do have an FAQ that addresses that concern, which is more or less that while there isn't like definitive research on this question, there are people who are working on that research right now. And the response is that generally, these open access policies drive more traffic to these smaller independently published journals, because there's broader awareness of the article itself, and it brings people back to that journal. So, the Harvard, the UCs, who just produce so much scholarly research, they've had these policies for over a decade, and it hasn't led to, both big publishers like Elsevier and smaller publishers, like I think in this instance, our faculty were very concerned about the Journal of California History. It hasn't forced these journals, which is actually UC Journal, to shutter. It's actually increased traffic to these journals as well. So those were the concerns. I don't know if Andrew, you heard similar things at Northridge, but I would think strategically it would actually be great to get a champion from the history department to work on this open access policy to help get more buy-in, because we did have that supporter here on campus. And we also kind of noticed there was more of like a generational divide in the faculty in the history department. So, the supporter who I talked a lot with, there are a couple of them, they were already doing more like open scholarship. Like one of them has an oral history website talking about housing disparities in the Bay Area. So she was already sort of inclined to want to share things openly. So, I think having her support helped with those conversations, as well as just, continually being in dialogue with this person. Sorry, one last thing about that too that I'll add is that our dean is a historian by training, and he has good relationships with the history department. So that helped too for our dean, John Wensler, to be able to talk directly to historians as a historian, to talk about like what the benefits are, to their department, even if the benefit is it actually just doesn't apply to you if you're just publishing books.
Thank you.
Yeah, Juan Carlos, go ahead. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I just want to thank both of you for sharing your experience. Cole has been actively John's been sharing with us sort of the progress of this, and we were all excited to hear last spring that this was passed. So kudos to the great work that you're doing. Mike, I have two questions. One is you mentioned the work leading up to the actually passing of this open access policy, but obviously the work doesn't stop there. I'm more interested in the implementation, particularly the deposit of articles, because often that's always been a challenge, particularly universities who've had institutional repositories for years, the challenge of getting faculty to deposit those into the IR. So if you can speak briefly about how that's going, with the library, how the library's providing support, or whether it's the collaboration with the colleges. So that's my question about that. And then I have another question I'll ask after that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. Or Daisy, do you want to take this one? Okay. Yes, that is always a challenge. We had this slide there for a reason, which is basically that implementation will be a challenge, but by having this type of policy, we at least removed the hurdle of either negotiating for the rights in your contract to be able to deposit a version to the institutional repository, or knowing what the copyright status is. But we see, increasing the deposit rate as just like a continual issue that we'll be working on with this. So it'll be like Daisy and I have been doing our road shows, talking to deans, chairs, faculty members directly. We worked with the Committee on Research recently to send out a communique to all faculty members about this, which included specific language of, hey, great news. You now have retained all of your rights, like 100% rights retention, right? Because of this policy, like we went from 0 to 100%. However, here's the language too in this policy that faculty members need to deposit their articles, by or before the date of publication to a repository. We are looking into what other solutions there may be to encourage deposit. We know like other campuses, the UCs use tools to make it easier for faculty members to deposit, like by automating sending emails like, congratulations on your publication. Here's the link. All you have to do is upload the file. We'll take care of the metadata. So we'll be looking into stuff like that to just make it easier for faculty, but also to just increase open access. I think we've also on the flip side been trying to communicate the benefit to the faculty member by depositing their work to ScholarWorks or some other, open repository. So for instance, I do food insecurity research, and in a recent paper that I co-authored with some other faculty and staff and students on our campus, we published it. This was pre-open access policy, but our contract included, depositing a certain version into the institutional repository. So I uploaded that, and within a few weeks, it had already been crawled by Google Scholar. And then within, a couple of months, it comes up as one of the top one of the top results in Google Scholar when you're looking at college students and food insecurity, because Google Scholar, prioritizes works where there's open access articles to the results. So I think that, we're going to first try to not talk about it so much as a compliance issue with deposit, and more talk about like the increased citations that open access articles get, the more likelihood of getting picked up by policymakers, your students being able to find this work once they graduate. We're really going to try to focus on more of those positive elements before switching towards anything more compliance focused, I would say.
Thank you. The other question I have, you touched on it a little bit about, I think Jayati asked this question, but this is a more broader question as far as what disciplines, you mentioned history, and maybe this is a more social sciences generalization, but did you find advocates or supporters in one particular discipline over the other, where the science is more supportive initially, or is it the arts, or is it the humanities? If you can speak briefly, as far as recommendations on where the champions came from. Obviously, we want champions coming from all disciplines, but were there early on, where were your core champions initially? I know you were identifying faculty who were publishing in open access, but if you can share sort of your experience with who the champions were at the beginning, if they were disciplines based or not.
Yeah, so I would say like there are disciplines that are just more open oriented. Education, particularly because they're educating people who won't have, most likely won't have access to these expensive databases, but do a lot of evidence-based, teaching and different type of stuff. So I think the College of Education is a good place to look for supporters. A lot of the sciences like physics, biology, places that have, those preprint archives that are active and are more inclined to sharing are good. I think finding another thing that I would say is that while this isn't universal for who was like our major champions, that like younger faculty members tend to have more experience with like understanding these barriers and the value of open publishing. So I think that there's, you know, not so much like our task force members, but like when we would reach out to senators, people who were newer to their position at East Bay or more recent graduates from their PhD program, were like, yeah, of course I want to support this. Like, you know, we're already having these conversations about it. So I think that was good places to look for. And, you know, for me, I think having Vanessa early on, like the way that she describes herself is that she's a former Catholic whose new religion is open science. So she is deeply passionate about open science. I mean, she started an open access journal with some colleagues in kinesiology from around the world. So like having her as more of the face of the effort was really effective because, you know, she's a prolific researcher, she's incredibly passionate about it, and she does a lot of biomedical and quantitative research. So I think that she could speak to, you know, faculty in a variety of fields that I couldn't have the same sway with. Great,
thank you. The last thing is sort of a comment, and I don't know if there's other questions, but you mentioned Peter Suber, who, you're right, he is a rock star in OA, and he's published quite a bit on OA, and that actually has been providing a lot of advice. But I'll put in the chat a book that he's written recently. I mean, it's a couple of years old, but it does provide a good overview of open access and the various issues. So you're probably both familiar with this book here, but I would recommend, it's a quick read, so I would recommend anyone, if they have time to read this book. It's openly available.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say I definitely let out a squeal of excitement the first time I got an email from Peter Suber, because I was like, I can't believe that this person like knows who I am. Because he just has, you know, he's done so much for the open access community. Daisy, I see we have one question in the chat as well from Robert that says, are publishers obligated to modify their contracts based on this policy? How does this policy change the way that authors interact with publishers at the time of signing a publication agreement? Yeah, so that's a great question. So essentially, there's an FAQ that is in there, that in our FAQs, that talks about like the legal mechanisms for how this works. But essentially, the spirit of it is you can't give away something that's no longer yours, right? So what the policy does from a legal perspective is it preemptively retains the right for the faculty. And the mechanism is that by passing this policy, we're saying that we will give what's called a non-exclusive license, which is the same thing as like every time you view a film on Netflix, you're using a non-exclusive license, right? It's not just yours. Millions of people can view it at the same time or eventually, but you're giving this license. So as a faculty member, we preemptively give a non-exclusive license to the university, which then gives the university the right to host our article on ScholarWorks, our institutional repository. And the university automatically transfers back to us all of our copyrights. So that's the legal mechanism that allows that to happen. So what that means is that with our relationships with publishers, we sign the contract as is, because the agreement, this policy that we already have with our university, supersedes anything that's in your publishing agreement. We also don't have to notify publishers of this. That said, I would say that, you know, part of why we offer the addendum that you can generate is because faculty members may feel more comfortable with telling their publisher that they're covered by this policy. Also, like with the UCs, Harvard, and other earlier institutions, they did reach out to publishers like to notify them that this policy exists, here's the terms, this and that. And, you know, the CSUs were more than a decade post Harvard and the UCs having this policy. So it's less I think there's less of a need for us to notify publishers, you know, like at large, that this is going on. Instead, we just have our publicly facing documents that talk about that. But essentially, Robert, like, it doesn't change the way that we interface with the publishers. It doesn't change the way that we sign the agreement. We sign it as is, but we retain our rights, even if there's language in the agreement that says that you're giving, you know, all copyright to the journal.
Thank you so much, Daisy and Lana, for a fantastic presentation. I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to work with you both more in the future on different events and research as well. I think we're hoping that we can learn a lot from your experience, because you all did a lot, right, over 4 or 5 years that we can use here at LA to establish similar policies. So thank you again.